I call Alfred Nara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call on this bill. Mr Speaker, for the Child Protection, Child Sex Offender Register Bill. Mr Speaker, there are some comments that were made just in regards to the whole aspect of a register and its importance. I just want to say that the purpose of the register is to provide the authorities with another tool. It doesn't just exist on its own as a list that people will look at and then make a judgment and create some analysis. Just to provide a little bit of background information, so what has happened previously, there's been the role of information sharing between different agencies, and that's played quite an important role, especially with police and with corrections. In fact, back in 2012, this role was significant because it was at that time where they were able to, through that information sharing, identify a convicted sex offender who was actually a teacher at a school. And without that information sharing, that would not have happened. That was critically important. It highlighted the need to have the analysis, to have good data, good information that allowed them to be able to make a judgment call about what needed to happen in that case. Mr Speaker, in 2013, a collaboration between police and corrections meant they set up what they call as the CISO, the Centre for Information for Sexual Offending. That was set up particularly so that there could be both the analysis of the information, but also in what they will call, be able to form a product of intelligence that allowed them to give a profile around a particular offender to the individual. That was critically important. Out of that analysis, they were then to be able to have individual profiling, which allowed them to be able to then make an assessment about the risk factor of that offender. Now, the purpose then for this bill and for this register is to fit into that context. So, number one, the Centre for Information in Sexual Offending will become the administrator of the register. The second thing, it adds to the analysis because it gives regular, up-to-date information that allows them to be able to have that. Currently, there is no legislation framework that allows them to be able to do that. Now, in order to be able to minimise risk, you have to have an appropriate management risk framework. So this fits into a framework. It is not purely a list that exists on its own. It has an administrator. It has two key stakeholders, the police and collaboration, working together. They have the analysis. What the register will do is give them up-to-date information that enables them to make an assessment at that point in time. Their role is to both monitor and manage the risk. That's the reason for the register. That's the reason why it's actually absolutely important in order for us to have this register inside that framework to truly make a difference to both reducing the risk of offending, and at the same time too, I would agree with the member David Clendon, to be able to then provide other forms of rehabilitation that may be appropriate to the offender. That's the reason that is there. Mr Clendon also made comment around the $146 million. Now, we all had the inquiry and the information that we wanted to be able to ask, so how, when we think about the cost-benefit analysis, that $146 million, almost 2/3 of it is already consumed in current roles of responsibility that is already there. So we're not talking a huge amount of extra fund that's going to be used to be able to administer this register that's being proposed at the moment, Mr Speaker. That's critically important. We also feel that that's important because, again, it enables them to be able to have this up-to-date information as well. Mr Speaker, one of the things that had happened, we had 135 substantive submissions. We had 98 of those submissions which talked about the need, and I'll take Mr Derek Ball's comment about making the register public. Now, there was concern because they felt that the public needed to have the information. In fact, many submitters talked about the right of the public to have that information so that it could give them the ability to be able to assess their own risk, their own challenges that they had in their own communities. And you would have to say, well, you know, there is some merit in that submission, in that advocacy for that. But Mr Speaker, what we did see, there was some comment that there was no evidence. Well, there is evidence. It was presented to us. There's a study by Prescott and Rockoff in 2011 from the Columbia University in the States, and it was substantive enough to identify two things. The first thing that it identified is this: there is little or no evidence to demonstrate that making the register accessible to the public improves public safety overall. So here's the evidence. The fact is that they were saying is that, look, there's no evidence to say that by making it public, it was going to be able to reduce the offending that was in there. But here's the thing that I think is actually really important too. is that inside of that, it said that we find that the evidence that the registration reduces the frequency of offences by providing law enforcement with information on sex offenders. Mr. Speaker, there is evidence. It does prove the importance of the register. Number one, to be able to have approved, accredited providers who would ensure that those key stakeholders have that information. We did ask the question to ensure that, yes, that information not be able to be breached or leaked out into the public, to ensure, in a sense, the confidentiality. However, the balance is this, Mr. Speaker. Do we have the right information to create the right analysis so the monitoring and the managing of high-risk offenders could be put in place? Mr. Speaker, we think that's important as well. The last thing I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that this government has also passed other forms of legislation, which is the PPO, which is the public scrutiny information that's provided, Mr. Speaker. It's the public protection orders and the enhanced extended supervision orders, which is also in place, Mr. Speaker. When there are high-risk offenders, this form of legislation will ensure that the enhanced extended supervision orders is actually still behind the wire. It means there's accommodation that's there. Mr. Speaker, that's another tool, along with the register, to ensure that we both monitor and manage high-risk offenders that are at risk, that could be at risk to our communities. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it's about keeping our children, our communities safe. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill in second reading to the House.
Okay.
The next call.